discussing the very many forms of Brahmin and so on, excuse me, my ancestors were running around in Europe sort of beating our oxes and trying to make a living in little huts. So we have a lot to learn from India, and I hope that now you guys, with your great technology talents, will pretty soon do much better than what we have done in the past. However, I think the kind of topic that I study has not been very popular in India so far, and so it might be interesting for you to hear this new perspective. I also realized that I didn't realize it was so far away that you may not be able to read everything, so I'll say everything as well. So the topic today is human evolution, and I will argue, as was already mentioned before, that cooperation was vital for the emergence of humans. And before I go on, I would like to acknowledge my co-author, Judith Burkhardt, who has done most of the experiments that I will be reporting about. When you get to my age, all you do is talk, and other people do the actual work. And one day you'll get there too. So, my topic is evolutionary anthropology, which really has two main steps. And the first step is simply to find out what humans are. And we used to think we knew that humans were very distinct, but the last 50 years have made that picture a lot more complicated. So we have to compare human beings with our closest living relatives. And I don't know whether you're familiar with this kind of representation. What this is a phylogenetic tree. When you look at relatedness among species, nowadays it's all done with molecular methods. So what you see is that there is the bonobo and there is the chimpanzee, and they share a common ancestor. And there's humans. Humans share a common ancestor with these apes, and then there's gorillas, and so on. And so all of life is connected in some way to each other. You can put all of life in a tree like this. And even if at the very beginning we don't know whether it started once or twice, but in principle you can do that. And so the challenge is then to figure out, this is what I indicated with that little red sign there, what were the features that evolved de novo for the first time during human evolution that were not already present in the ancestors. So we're looking for what we call the derived traits of humans. And to know that, we have to know what our relatives do. And in India, you're just as unblessed as we are in Europe if you don't have great apes. And great apes, these species that I mentioned, are our closest living relatives. And until about 50 years ago, and I have here a picture of Jane Goodall, a name you're probably all familiar with, we didn't know much about great apes. But in the meantime, we have long-term field studies and captive studies on all these species of great apes, so the gorillas, the bonobos, the orangutans, and the chimpanzees. And we've learned a tremendous amount of what they do, and we found out that many, many things we thought were uniquely human are actually already seen in one or more of these species of great apes. So, for instance, for a long time, we thought that only humans can think of the future and plan ahead and have what's known as episodic memory, so they remember specific events in the past. We now know that great apes do the same thing. For a long time, we used to think that only humans have technology. We now know that all of these apes have some form of simple technology. We used to think that only humans have culture, and that they transmit information socially, and rather than let the genes do the transmission, we have social transmission. We now know that all these apes do that too, and so on and so on. So, in many respects...
So they can use that phrase. Yes, that game is there.
Pardon me?
It's there. It's there. Use it.
What should I use?
This one.
Oh, so I should move, is what you're saying. Okay, I'll stay put. What are you trying to tell me? No, I know you're right. It's just that I like to. Okay, where was I? Yes, great ape. So, in retrospect, it should not have been all that surprising, because there was also around the same time, around 1960, that molecular biologists started to look And they used immune responses and proteins and so on, stuff that is now looks very primitive. Later on, they started to use DNA sequences with the non-coding DNA. And what did they find? Of course, the same tree that I showed you earlier. And what they found was that humans are African great apes. So all of you, your ancestors, came out of Africa not so long ago, maybe 50, 60,000 years ago. And so what you see is that now these numbers have changed a little bit, but that, say, humans and chimpanzees and bonobos shared a common ancestor, now we would say 6 to 9 million years ago. And that means that we, if you look back to our fathers and fathers and fathers and fathers and mothers and mothers, etc., about 6 to 8 million years ago, were indistinguishable from these kinds of animals and their ancestors. So we were all one species in those days. And if you go back further, we had a common ancestor with the gorillas, and even further with the orangutans. So that's not very long, right? The order of 10 million years is not very long in evolution. So that would underscore the fact that we really are great apes. And to make that point very, very clear, if you ask a chimpanzee or bonobo whether their closest living relative is the gorilla, which looks very similar to it, and in fact, if you do the analysis of growth, if you take the growth curve of a chimpanzee and you expand it a bit, you get a gorilla. Is that the closest living relative, or is this naked, upright, large-headed, arrogant species? And then what the chimpanzee will have to admit to its great shock and horror is that we are more closely related to them than the gorilla is. So this is how closely related we are, which is actually quite shocking, probably on both sides, but it also explains why we are so similar, which of course raises the mystery why we are so different. I've never seen an auditorium full of orangutans or gorillas listen to an old orangutan or a gorilla tell a story. So there's something that happened that was very, very profound, and that's basically the mystery we're trying to solve. But the first thing we need to do before we can do that is ask, well, who are we? Humans, as you know, there's a lot of us. And there's immense variety in culture and in language, for instance, and in what we do. This is the city I live nowadays. Of course, you live in this place. I don't think by studying these people, or these people over there, we are actually exactly finding out how humans live. And we lived for 95% of our time, and many of us for longer, in a very different way. We lived as hunter-gatherers, and we lived as mobile, nomadic hunter-gatherers, which is a lifestyle that virtually nobody can imagine anymore because it's very, very rare nowadays. It's just a few thousand people that will do this. This is the Marshall expeditions in southern Africa. These are the pygmies in the Zaire forest. There may still be some in India, I don't know. Apparently not, but let's find out. I'm sure you will remind me during the questions. And so the hunter-gatherers are extremely useful, these mobile ones, the nomadic ones, because the immense variability that we see in humans is much reduced. They are a much more homogeneous lot. They tell us a much more coherent story. And so if we now do this comparison, what is different between humans, if we define humans as the way we used to live until very, very recently, let's say 10,000 years ago, and the apes, and I condense 20 lectures into one lecture, we get the following results. So this is really, every topic that comes is a lecture on its own. The first thing that is really, really crucial, it turns out, is that we've developed a totally new ecology. When you think monkey, you think banana, right? And so the average primate is a fruit eater. The average human was a meat and underground storage organ tuber eater. So for a long time, about 2 million years probably, we had become hunters, but we did this in a very strange way. Instead of just hunting and eating it, our ancestors hunted and then took it to a place, processed it, and shared it with others. And so it's known as cooperative hunting, but in a way there is systematic food sharing, which is very important. The other thing is that we always live in extended families, and these hunter-gatherer small groups are called camps, which are about roughly 25 people on average. Everybody helps out in raising the children. So that's a form of cooperative breeding. And cooperative breeding will come back in this talk many times. We also, as you know, covered the earth, colonized all the continents. So that's the one first striking difference. And any biologist would say, well, the way you subsist is going to affect how you live and how you behave socially and how you think. So this is going to be a key factor. The other thing we do, of course, is we have evolved a form of culture that's known as cumulative culture, which is very different from what the apes are doing. And the most striking feature there is that we teach our young, sort of what's happening right now. Pretty soon the young will teach the old too, but that'll be the next step in evolution. We also have a very different life history, and that is that virtually unique among all animals, in the middle of life, the females of our species stop reproducing and then continue to live for several decades, which is quite unusual and requires, of course, an explanation. The other thing we do is that we have very high birth rates for an ape, especially for an ape of our brain. We should expect 10-year interbirth intervals at least for an ape of our brain size. We are, among the hunter-gatherers, at about 3.5, so there's something special that happened there. We also evolved pair bonding. So not only do we cooperate during raising our kids, we also have part of that cooperation funneled into a pair bond where the male partner in this pair bond helps out. There's a lot of provisioning going on. None of that was present among our ancestors, among the apes. And needless to say, we are a hyper-cooperative species. There's been a lot of interest on the part of economics recently, because economists always assumed that Homo economicus, that we were a very utilitarian species looking for its profit. And then when people started to do actual experiments, they found out that people aren't that way at all. They found that people are actually quite nice. It's called other regarding preferences in economics. The psychologists call that proactive prosociality, and that's something we'll come back to because that's a key psychological underpinning. We believe in fairness. We do many, many things together, collective action, and in fact we do coordinated collective action. So we actually coordinate before we act, which is quite a lot of work and requires a lot of cognitive ability. And finally, you were waiting for it, of course, is that we have unusual cognition. We are truly, almost certainly, the smartest animal on this planet. And psychologists would say this is based on something they call shared intentionality, where individuals form joint goals and pursue them together in a coordinated way. And as you'll see, that is also something we do not see in many other species. The key to that is cultural intelligence, which we'll come to. And just to illustrate this, here's the brain of a human being and the brain of a chimpanzee. See, the mouth of a chimpanzee is a lot bigger than the mouth of a human being, but our brain is about 3 times as large. And I'll show you a slide later that says that all of that expansion of about 1,000 cc happened in the last 2 million years. So there's been a dramatic change. So now we have this conundrum, right? We are African great apes. We are more closely related to the chimpanzees than the gorilla is, and yet, look at all these differences, dramatic differences. So the obvious question is where that comes from. And what I want to pursue is the idea that this very basic change underlies everything. And so let's have a look at what they do. The key word, if you're a forager, is cooperate or die. If you're not cooperating, you're a dead man. They have to help in rearing the offspring. If you don't get any help, you cannot rear your offspring. They have to cooperate in getting prey. And especially before, and that's very recent, when there were poison arrows invented, for instance, and arrows itself, or a recent phenomenon like 20, 30, 40,000 years. Before that happened, the men always had to hunt together because it was much too dangerous to hunt alone. And so you have to be able to rely on each other, you have to fully trust each other. That's the way humans work. And again, for you that's really obvious, but think of the ancestors, the great ape-like ancestors, that wasn't obvious at all. Also, even in the gathering, as you probably know, men do the hunting, women do the gathering in those societies, there is a lot of cooperation going on. And in many cases, there is what you might call resource pooling, where all the food is put together and shared. And so, if you want to sort of make a cartoon summary of this, you could say that great apes are independent. It's every ape on its own, at least once they're weaned from their mother, whereas humans, at least among the foragers, are interdependent. So they have to cooperate or die. A lone ape can survive if a lone ape is injured. To that, if a human is injured, others take care of it. Right? It's a big difference. So we are an intensely cooperative species. So that's the difference. The question now is, step 2, is once we've described the difference, how do we explain it? And this has been for a long time a real problem, because how do you explain something unique? Then you get unique explanations that are untestable. Fortunately, what we try to do, of course, is look at things that happen somewhere else in biology and look for parallels. And that's the track I'm exploring in this talk. So it's called the comparative method. It looks like this. So you have this phylogenetic tree. I showed you a little part of it earlier. So we have species A to K. The structure of the tree is determined using other characters than the ones we're interested in. So say, in this case, we would use the molecules to create the tree. So this is giving us the genealogical relationships among the species that we're interested in. Now we can map characters. So for instance, if this is humans, and we know that a lot of stuff happened in this lineage, we look for other lineages in which something similar happened. And so for instance, if it is this socioecology that we have, we can ask about cooperative breeding and cooperative hunting and see whether when we see other species that evolved that, because we can always ask where did it happen by looking at the related species and say, well, these guys don't do it and these do it, so it evolved in this branch. So we have a contrast, is what we call this. And then we can ask, okay, what do these kinds of species, always compared to the sister taxa, what do they have in common that tells us something about what, for instance, cooperative breeding or cooperative hunting does to you? What kind of changes does that cause? And if you can see a pattern there, you can apply it to human evolution. That's the logic. So let's have a look. Cooperative hunting. It happens quite a bit. Here is African wild dogs, lions, wolves, killer whales, and indeed even chimpanzees do some of it. We'll get to that. What you expect is that that should be accompanied by a bunch of behavioral traits, such as when you're together, you know, as you probably know, these animals sort of mill around for a bit before they go and hunt. They have to get together and coordinate. Okay? Then they have to be very tolerant around food, because if they're not, the next time, the one who doesn't get anything to eat will not help with the hunt. So they have to have some form of food sharing. Now, do they have an equal food sharing? That turns out to be quite an issue. In lions, you get quite a lot of aggression. In hyenas, you get quite a lot of aggression, even though they're cooperative. And this is the chimpanzee example. What you see is that chimpanzee also do some cooperative hunting. Here you see they're actually eating a monkey and somebody's trying to get some food. The sharing is far from equal. And the social tolerance around food is also limited. And I'll illustrate that with the following slide. We just looked at food sharing. These are experiments we did. This is not meat, but it's regular food, but the patterns of it. So what you see in human children, at least in Switzerland, is the following pattern. You see a little bit of dark green, which is passive sharing, which means I have something and somebody else comes and takes it, and I do not resist. The resisted ones are not included here because that would make a very different picture, or it would strengthen. Then we have light green. Somebody comes to me and says, oh, can I have some of your water, please? And I hand it. And then we have this light blue, about a quarter, which is, oh, I think you need some water, please. Proactive, right? Without being asked. Now look at how the chimps are sharing. The great majority is of this passive variety. And like I said, I left out some other things, which is refusal. No, you can't have everything. That's quite a lot too. But you see, it simply extends the same conclusion. There's a tiny bit of light blue, of this proactive. And there is a relatively modest amount of this reactive. So what you see is that the pattern of food sharing is quite different, suggesting to me that cooperative hunting is probably not the solution to our story. Also, capuchins, they do some hunting, the males do, and with some food sharing. So they might also, if cooperative hunting were important, these two should show a pattern. And again, they're very much like the chimpanzee. Now look at these little monkeys, and I'll get to you why they are important. They have a lot of blue, and they are a bit like the human children in that respect. So they have a lot of offering. And why did I put them like this? Because in this order, we go from absolutely no care by anybody but the mother to care by a lot of individuals, including the extended maternal care. And so that suggests that this cooperative breeding idea, that the fact that we share the burden of rearing our offspring, may be an important factor. So let's look at that. We know hunter-gatherers do this in a really important way, and even modern people do it in an important way, because in many cases, even with nuclear families, grandmothers move to be close to their daughters and their grandchildren. We also see that in mammals, but not so much. It's not a mammalian thing to do, because in mammals, the first step that you need to take, namely the presence of a father, is rare. For good biological reasons, pregnancy and lactations are uniquely female affairs, so males cannot contribute much, and they tend to. We see it a lot more in birds. Again, it's not surprising, because birds start out with male-female care of the offspring, and then adding other helpers is not such a big deal. What we expect in cooperative breeding, for them to work, we expect high social tolerance. We expect responsiveness to signals of need from others. In other words, if one of these kids needs something, you have to respond to it. But perhaps even better, before the kid screams, you want to help it, because that might attract predators and the kids might fall or something. So you expect some kind of general help, how do you say that, a predisposition to offer help even when you're not being asked. And this is where these little Cooperative monkeys come in. These monkeys are in another part of our tree, in the New World primate. And everything else here is Old World primates, so we have the apes to the Old World monkeys here, rhesus monkeys, Hahnemann langus, and so on. They're somewhere here, Old World. The New World monkeys, we see one family, the Cooperative, that evolved this cooperative breeding the way we see in humans. And so that's why we look for this species and other relatives, and also in other mammals. Later I'll show you something, to see what cooperative breeding does. So what we see there is we have a breeding pair, so a male and a female, and they have lots of offspring. As you can see, there's a whole bunch of them. The offspring tend to stay around, and often because they cannot easily settle somewhere else. Anyway, and instead of just sitting on their hands, they're actually helping their parents raise the next batch of offspring. That's what we call cooperative breeding. And so the caregivers are fathers, plus all these older offspring, which is why we also speak of allomaternal care, so we care by others than the mother. And what they do is they share food. So here we have an example where an older helper has caught a nice insect and is giving it to a young. The young don't have these nice pups yet. And what they do is they actually give a call. It attracts the little ones, and then they share it. They carry the infants from the very first day. They carry the infants, so the mother hardly carries infants. Sometimes, of course, because kids have to be nursed and so on, so they carry them sometimes, but most of the time she doesn't carry. And they seem to be creating vigilance duties, so some are carrying, some are being sentinel, and they are very good at forming a collective to defend the group when they, for instance, run into the neighbors. So you see, this is a form of collective action, of course, coordinated collective action, which is not that common among primates in general. So we see a lot of interesting behavior. And before I then look at the details, we want to make a very important distinction that goes back to Nico Tinberg, a Nobel Prize winner. I don't think that he talked here, but he should have. He made this very, very important distinction when it comes to behavior. Ask, why does an animal do this? And then what you mean is, why is what it does contributing to its lifetime reproductive success? So what's the function, and is this adaptive? And you could also ask, what were the predecessor behaviors? Again, you go into this phylogenetic tree. Well, how did this behavior evolve? Or what antecedents did it evolve? Are why questions. The other set of questions are how questions. So for instance, you can ask, well, what mechanisms produce this behavior? You see, these are very different questions. And often people confuse them, and it's extremely important that we keep them distinct. And of course, so just like you have a historical aspect here, you can ask, how did this behavior develop during the lifetime of the individual? This is known as proximate, that's known as ultimate, how versus why. This very important distinction I will follow here as well, because you can say, okay, suppose you have a new natural history. We become cooperative breeders and hunters. We were not that before. That has a new function. Evolution, the selection is on these outcomes. But what it really selects for, of course, is a bunch of these mechanisms that produce these outcomes, immediate consequences. And later on, we'll see whether you also get delayed evolutionary consequences from it, because you have a phenomenon called acceptation. Just like because we became bipedal for some reason, that freed up our hands, and much later, millions of years later, we could start doing things with our hands because we had become bipedal. And so you get interesting consequences for something much later that, of course, evolution did not foresee, but it still happened. And so, if we now look at this cooperative breeding, just as an example, you say, okay, what do we see is happening out there? We see that they coordinate their actions. We see that they move infants, transfer infants from one to another. We see that they share food and provisions, so they actually bring food. What do you need for that? So this is the function side of it. What do they need for that? Well, they have to be able to coordinate their actions and look at others and see what they also have to have high social tolerance. They have to respond to signals of need, and they have this proactive prosociality, this other regarding preferences. That is what we think they need to make this work. Now, obviously, you need to test this. So to do experiments that show that's set up as design where individuals can help others without being solicited and without expecting return. So totally proactive, as we do here. And see if this set of predictions actually holds. So here's the design. It's a very simple thing we call group service. There's a group of monkeys in the cage. Here's a machine, very, very high fashion, high technological. If you pull this thing, the box over there goes there. Why is this important? This animal does not get the food. Of course, we have many training phases so that everybody understands. We actually measure social tolerance in the same experiment before we do this part. And so what you see is that if this animal pulls, somebody else can take the food, but not this animal. So it's proactive, right? It is, nobody's asking, they just sit there. If they pull the food, somebody gets the air conditioning all over the place. And so this is what happened. In this particular species, you will recognize it looks like rhesus monkeys. It's Japanese macaques, but in rhesus monkeys you will probably get very similar results. This is what happened. To add one more thing. This is the mom and that was the dog. So, not much there. Let's look at these color traits again. I hope you can see it in the back. So here's somebody sitting at the place. Here's the food. We've now done this in 15 different species, 24 different groups. It took us 4 years. And this is what we found. If you quantify the amount of allo-maternal care, so the degree of cooperative breeding, and you look at amount of proactive prosociality, so these unsolicited helping, see very strong correlation. And we've tested all kinds of alternative hypotheses, cooperative breeding and hunting and all these things. None of that works. So what you see is that these three species here are callitrichid monkeys, the same kind. Here's another species you're familiar with, Homo sapiens. Children in Switzerland that did the same thing. And you see they have the maximum score. And we did it exactly like with the monkeys. We didn't tell them anything. We just let them do their thing. And here are the closest to what we think of as our ancestors, the chimpanzees. Chimpanzees do not do. While we're at it, we can also look at how socially tolerant these species are. And indeed, you see pretty much the same trend. So social tolerance, which we also thought was important for these kinds of actions, is also very high in these cooperative breeders. You see two more species where it's high. This other species where non-mothers carry the infants. And you also see it's high in a species that is very low on the previous scale. Here it is, the gibbon, the white-handed gibbon. But they live in pairs. So within the pair, they're highly tolerant, but they're not pro-social. So tolerance is necessary, but it's not sufficient. You need something else. And so if you now look, we didn't do this kind of work with other species. We would like to do it. But if you look at wild dogs, for instance, African wild dogs, and here in India you have a dhole, which probably does something very, very similar. It would be extremely interesting to test them on this. What you see is that they actively provision the immatures, and to the point that these immatures have the right to eat. So the immatures eat first and the adults hold back. Now, that's not what you would see in lions or hyenas, where everybody has to fight for it. They adopt non-related pups, so they're very much looking for ways to help. Very interestingly, because we also see that in humans, they help injured and old pack members. We see something similar in our callitrichid monkeys. So that sounds like something that we humans do and our ancestors didn't do. It is very similar, and they also have something to do with this cooperative breeding, this elephant-maternal care. And they actually console them, comfort each other after aggression. We see a few of these tendencies in elephants, which are only partly on they're sort of halfway on the elephant-maternal care scale. We see adoption, and we see that, again, this support for the sick and injured, which I think is really an interesting issue to pursue. This is all I have to say about non-primates, because we didn't do systematic tests. But I am encouraging people to do this, especially here in India, where this is African elephants. I don't know the Indian elephants, but you have relevant species in this country that you could work with. Anyway, to get back to this thing, we tested these two. This one is very hard to test because we cannot standardize that across species yet. But basically, what you then expect is that this combination should allow them to do all kinds of things which among primates are special. So understanding gaze and perspective, which means that if I see somebody looking somewhere, I actually understand they're looking at something interesting and I follow their gaze and look at that same thing. And so we learn something together. In many species, that is rare. Social learning, which turns out to be critical. It is learning from each other. Obviously, it requires high social tolerance. And of course, they can have this attentional bias. Cooperative problem solving, needless to say. Vocal communication. These guys, these cooperative breeders, have much more to say to each other. And we'll actually see they have larger vocal repertoires. They have many more different kinds of calls to talk to each other about. And their infants are actually showing badly. Right? They, just like human babies, they try out their vocalizations. They have to learn it. And finally, we expect something that is very, very, very important. That instead of, because based on this spontaneous prosociality, instead of just allowing others to watch you, you're helping them acquire the skills. You're actively transmitting the information. And so these, at the moment, are predictions. So let's have a look. What we did was we compared, and I, normally this has long lists of references in it, and I left it blank. Let's keep it simple. If you're interested, we can go to the publication. Just send me an email and I can send you the PDF. We compared these callitrichid monkeys, these cooperative breeders, with the most closely related sister group, capuchin monkeys and squirrel monkeys, which, by the way, are much bigger and bigger brained. So they should be much cleverer. But if you see at all these social items, these callitrichids outperformed, or at best were equal, to these larger brained, larger bodied sister taxa, suggesting that cooperative breeding gives you an immediate advantage in the social cognition domain, right? And you get it for free as a test, just to make sure there was not some weird bias. If you look at the non-social cognitive abilities, stuff like, general cognitive abilities, so executive control and physical capabilities and so on, you see they actually score more poorly, as they should, because they're much smaller brain. So, in principle, this result here is not an artifact, because we see the opposite there, where we actually expect it. So, there's something very interesting happening. Now, to get back to this teaching, if we now look at cooperative breeding, we know they are very socially tolerant, which must make it easier for social learning to work, and as a result, if some adult has something, it should be easier for offspring to acquire the same skills. You see there's another side coming, and that is this proactive prosociality, which we also demonstrated to be linked to cooperative breeding. Does that now lead to teaching, which would be the prediction? If it does, that would be massively increasing the efficiency of social learning. And so, basically what we expect is that if you are donating food, you might also donate information. You just want to help. And if we've done the analysis here, and we're still working on a more quantitative version of this, but so far this seems to work very well. There's a tiny little carnivore in the South African deserts called meerkats. There's been a lot of work on them, so you may have heard of them. They're cooperative breeders. They're very small. They have a form of teaching. These same monkeys show teaching. Humans, of course, show teaching. If you now look at the sister taxon of these callitrichnids, no teaching. The sister taxa of humans, great apes, no teaching. So it looks like cooperative breeding and teaching co-evolve. When you get cooperative breeding, you get teaching. So as the consequences, again, of these novel behaviors, cooperative breeding in this case, we see that when cooperative breeding evolves, you get at least these two, probably more, psychological changes that come along with it to enable this cooperative breeding. What you get, for free, so to speak, as a nice present from evolution, improves social cognition. You basically become a smarter animal simply by becoming a cooperative breeder, for free. What will be interesting, of course, is to see whether that then also has further repercussions down the line. And one of the things is, of course, well, when you get improved social cognition, think of social learning, social skill acquisition, you might as well start to build on that. The callitrichid monkeys didn't do it. They're very small and very small brain. But maybe in other situations that happens. And it might also be that you then should expect an increase in brain size. So we looked at that in a very broad way. We looked at hundreds of mammalian species. We also did it in birds. It works the same way. And we tried to quantify the amount of care that comes in to the mother. And if you look at that, what you get is that here's this allo care from very little to quite a lot. And here is the residual of brain size. That is brain size corrected for body size. And what you see, if you look at it by sub-order, there's other ways to arrange, you get pretty much the same result. You see a strong positive correlation. In other words, species that do cooperative breeding tend to be larger brained than the sister species that do not do cooperative breeding. So this sort of delayed consequence seems to be actually happening. Because, just to make sure, again, we're not creating an artifact, when we look at allo-nursing, this is the degree to which nursing mothers help each other, which is also a form of help. It's called communal breeding. We don't see the effect. And why not? Because here, energy is coming into the system. You're actually providing the female with energy of either relieving her or directly feeding her, whereas here there is no new energy coming in. And the brain is a very energy-hungry organ. That was the talk I gave in Pune. It's on the web. And so if you're interested in those details, you can take a look at that website. I'm sure there is an address somewhere that you can look at that can be provided. And so this suggests that if you provide the energy in a cooperative breeder, you can turn it into a larger brain and larger brains provide cognitive benefits. Which brings us to the question, the title of the talk, right? What does cooperation have to do with intelligence? Well, you already saw it a little bit, but let's find out how the argument works. First of all, what do we mean when we say intelligence? It's a very widely abused term. What I mean by it, which is sort of what the people who develop the IQ tests and so on mean by it, is something, the best thing is just to say behavioral flexibility. If something doesn't work, you try something else. You're not stuck in your routines. You can learn, you can reason, you solve a problem. If you now transplant that into the natural habitat in the daily lives of animals, what does that mean? It means that they come up with innovative behaviors, with new behaviors that are not part of the standard repertoire. So it's actually how you can measure it, and it correlates very nicely with brain size, for instance, across mammals. So now, imagine you are natural selection, and you would like to favor intelligence. As you know, curiosity killed the cat. I don't know whether is that also in India? Curiosity killed the cat?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Right. Curiosity killed the cat. There's a nice cartoon. Notice all the computations, theoretical scribblings, and lab equipment, Norm. Yes, curiosity killed these cats. And that is an extremely valid point. I study orangutans in the wild, and the young animals I study are not curious at all. They're not cats. They know innovation is costly and dangerous. You might kill yourself. You might get so involved in something that you totally forget to look out for predators. You might eat something that kills you. You might get your hand into something and it's a snake, it bites you. The best thing is not to innovate. That's number one. Number two, it gets worse. Suppose you are extremely clever. You make a brilliant innovation. That innovation gives you more calories or makes you live longer. So for one generation, you have a nice fitness benefit. But these are innovations. If there's no way to transmit them to the next generation, the advantage is lost again, and the next generation has to start at square one. That's why selection has a hard time favoring intelligence. And that's why the general solution for this thing is that we should expect higher intelligence always to go together with social learning. Because the social learning allows you to get these innovations from others. So the orangutans I study, for instance, until they're weaned, they do zero exploration. They just wait for mommy, we call it to bless. Mommy touches this, oh, now I can do this. If mommy doesn't touch it, I don't touch it. And so they basically circumvent this problem. And at the same time, this is taken care of. There is social transmission across generations of the innovations. Now you might argue that where do new innovations come from? That's also resolved because to be a really good social learner, you actually have to become clever. And then the innovations sort of come automatically, and also when you're older, you're more experienced. Okay, so that's the general point about intelligence. So that's why you now see why we come up with the term called cultural intelligence. That for species to become intelligent, culture has to be involved. And so here, the argument goes like this. The key term here is opportunities for social learning. How often am I in the position to learn something from somebody else? That should predict the repertoire of learned skills in the population if you keep everything else the same. And this is what we do in chimpanzees and orangutans. So green is chimps, orange is orangutans. What you're looking at here is the number of food-related, and they didn't get that right, innovative behaviors exhibited by individuals. So this is the number of innovations in the population you can acquire because it's in the pool, so to speak. And every point here is a population. So we compare populations, and what you see is that in both species, the more time you spend together, the larger the pool of innovations in the population. To put it really popularly, the more opportunities there are to go to school, the more you know, right? And you see it in both species. The chimp curve is steep because males are much more sociable, so they pull this whole thing up. If you would just look at females, it would be more like the orangutan curve. At that time, we didn't have today. Social opportunities for social learning are varying. If that is going on, you could imagine that If you're in a population where you have lots of opportunities for social learning, you already see where that's going, think of cooperative breeders, then it might actually be good to get more learned skills, right? These learned skills are helping you survive. They help you to get food, to avoid predators, to build a nice nest, and so on and so forth. The more opportunities there are for social learning, the more this can happen. So which species have these kinds of opportunities? Well, let's do a test. We looked at precocial birds, so birds in which the young can immediately walk around. And what we see there is that if you have more protectors after hatching, you see a larger brain, again, corrected for bodies. In altricial birds, where the young sit in a nest and have to become older before they can fly off, what you see is if they stay with their parents longer after they're able to fly, which means if they have more time they can learn from their parents, they tend to be larger. And finally, in solitary carnivores, we wanted to keep group living out. Solitary carnivores, you see, this is very similar. How long do you stay with your mother after weaning? In tigers, for instance, and brain size corresponding relationship. So there's, from all kinds of groups of animals, there's evidence that more opportunities for social learning means larger growth. So now connected up with cooperative breeding, if you have high social tolerance and especially teaching, as in cooperative breeders, we expect this to work. So you expect this positive feedback loop between having lots of social skills and having good transmission and therefore innovation. You expect that loop to work. So what you see in great apes, and I know Tetsuo Masazawa will come here as well, right? Yeah, and he will probably show the next slide, but then you know, oh, I've seen this before, I know how to place it into context. What you see in great apes, in these chimpanzees and in our orang, is that there's a thing called joint attention. So the mother is working with an object, the kid is playing close attention, right? We call it, he calls it apprenticeship, we've adopted that same term. So you see, we call it the peering practice cycle. You look exactly what your mother is doing. Your mother is doing something, you look very closely, and then when mother's done with it, and it takes a little rest, the kid goes and tries it too. Huh? Practice peering, and that goes on several years before they're good at things. It takes a long time, but for us it seems so obvious. It's their nuclear physics, so to speak, and their quantum theory. It takes a long time. This is what you see in apes. What you see in humans is this eye contact between mothers and infants, and this much more active participation. And Zebra and Gergely have called this pedagogy. This is an adaptation in the human lineage to maximize the efficiency of skill transmission across generations. So that, yes, you have joint attention just like there, but now we also have active teaching. We saw that is linked to cooperative breeding. And I added this little int to remind myself, this is intentional teaching. It is the sort of teaching that takes into account what the pupil knows and doesn't in the meerkats and the calatrix, these little organisms. That doesn't happen because that requires much cognition. But this, as you can imagine, maximizes the efficiency because I know exactly, as a parent, what my child doesn't know, and by that, this is how it works. And then it goes much faster. We also see extensive mother-infant communication. There's always this, and pointing, for instance, the kid points and then mommy steps in. There's this three-way interaction between mother, infant, and whatever is in the environment that attracts that attention. It goes around like this, and there's eye contact in both directions, and discouraging and encouraging. Look at children next time. They always have these little glance to mommy about things, right? So that goes back and forth, and there's facial expressions and so on. Here, mommy is totally passive. You can imagine what consequences that have. This is a slide I borrowed from Matsuzawa. When he looked, he had Japanese children and chimpanzees, his very well-trained chimpanzees, watching something on a television screen. The something was simply a lady who pours juice from a bottle into a glass. And this is the human kid's eye tracking. It had eye tracking software. This is where the eyes of the human kid went. Face object. This is where the eyes of the chimpanzees went, just to the objects. There's no information in the face, so don't bother even looking at it. And of course, he also tried the control where it was two chimps instead it was, and chimps watching chimp actions. The result is robust. So there's a big difference there that has a lot to do with it gets a bit technical here, and you can ignore this slide if you want. I just wanted to mention this is because I've done this together with one of the people from India that I work with, who's very, very bright, where we try to model this whole process. Because, as you remember, apes may have some culture, but they don't have cumulative culture, which I'll show you in the next slide. And the question is, during human evolution, how did that change? And what we find is when we start to model this stuff, is that this little parameter called alpha leads to very strongly nonlinear effects in this variable, which is basically the level of technological complexity you can achieve in your lifetime in the population. So this is the third level. What proportion of individuals reaches the third level? Okay. The details doesn't matter, but what you see is this nonlinearity here. And what is this little alpha? It's the efficiency of social transmission. And what we calculated is that our orangutans and chimpanzees are about there. So they're just at the cusp. There is indeed a few orangutan chimpanzee populations that have a little bit of cumulative culture, cumulative technology. No orangutans. And so what you get is to add teaching to the mix, which moves up your parameter, and you get this enormous boost. It's a nonlinearity. And so that suggests that if you now take a chimpanzee-like ancestor, using simple stick tools or using simple stone tools, and you add this teaching to the mix, before you know it, you have these fancy tools that we see emerge in human evolution about 2.5 million years ago. Now, these are the fancy forms. So this one emerged about 1.7 million years ago. This about 300,000 years ago. But what you can now make plausible that if you add teaching to the mix of grade A behavioral transmission, that you can suddenly make this quantum leap in technological complexity. So, I've given you some examples of what I think happened when our ancestors adopted cooperative breeding. We have seen this apprenticeship. If you now turn it into a human feature, you get this pedagogy, and you can imagine that transmission becomes much more efficient. And by the way, this is already a form of cooperation, of course, right? Because I am now cooperating with my child to make things. As a result, as I showed you in the previous slide, the simple material culture of grade A's can be turned into cumulative material culture that we see in humans starting roughly 2.5 million years ago. Something that requires additional attention is how important cooperative problem solving is in humans. Because now we've institutionalized it in universities and firms, but we don't know how important it has been in human evolution. But we can also apply this to other areas. So for instance, the evolution of language has always been a very, very mysterious feature. Right? Why suddenly does one species start to talk to each other? Well, we could have done it different ways. We could have done it with hand signals, but why do we do this? Again, I think you can see this, at least the beginning of it, as a form of information donation. So, if you look carefully at the vocal displays of most primates, the information it transmits is basically, I, who sent this information, am a great individual with high fitness potential, and you should either come and collaborate with me or be really afraid of me. In humans, we do that too, of course, as you know, just look at politics. But in addition, we do lots of other things with our language. Basically, in small group settings, language is used to inform each other, right? And this is known as declarative use. You can teach an ape to use language, with sign language, for instance, but it will 99.5% or more use what's known as imperative signals of this sort, and not declarative signals that we do. We talk about the weather. We talk about what we're going to do tomorrow, or how was it that Auntie so-and-so when you visited, and so on and so forth. So we have a lot more to say to each other, which goes back to the larger vocal repertoires of these cooperative breeders. I think you can see that, and actually they do some vocal learning as well, so I think cooperative breeding also had a lot to do with this. And then finally, the theory of mind abilities that we see, theory of mind is the ability to attribute, to assign mental states to others. So in other words, does this individual know something or not? No. I just had a non-theory of mind moment when I used the term without realizing that that's something you're not familiar with. That's theory of mind. Knowing that somebody else doesn't know, and you can do this with children, right? Whether somebody can have a different preference from the child. So you say, this so-and-so doesn't like rice, and the kid loves rice. It takes several years for a kid to realize that so-and-so doesn't like rice. Normally what they do is project this onto somebody else. So that's theory of mind. Chimpanzees, for instance, have it a little bit, but they only use it to outsmart their competitors. Humans have it, and they apply it in the so-called form of shared intentionality. In other words, this joining together in trying to reach a common goal. And so you see, that is the basis of our massive cooperation. And again, this kind of cooperation is cognitively complicated, so you see the link between cooperation and cooperation. So basically, this is the idea that we have, in the past, started out being pretty intelligent as chimpanzee-like animals. Added to that, I call it the motivational component, the psychological component of wanting to be nice to each other. So the cooperative breeding component, that together gave us this uniquely human cognition, because we had this energy effect of cooperative breeding allowing brains to get larger, and we had the teaching effects that donated information that turned from food to skills to vocal output called language, and that then helped us, put us on the path to humanity. And what's amazing is that it looks like the first elements of that were present in this species, Homo erectus, which evolved in Africa roughly 2 million years ago. And you see that this is also when the human brain, this is time, this is the cranial capacity of the fossil humans that we find. The human brain started to expand around 2 million years ago. So here what you see is this band. That's the brain sizes in which great apes are found. And you see our earlier ancestors, so-called Australopithecines, which lived between 4 and 2 million years ago, and some actually lived a bit longer. They did not leave the great ape range. They were almost certainly not cooperative breeders. And then around 2 million years ago, we see this massive increase, fairly steep increase, and that's when we guess the first elements of cooperative breeding came into being. This is not idle speculation, it's based on the archaeology we have, but I will not bore you with all these details. So, to sum up the story, when I started out saying, look, this is what we have found out that's different between humans and our closest living relatives, and therefore almost certainly our ancestors, what you see is a nice list. Look at it more closely. All that I put in red has to do with either being very nice to each other or to be very clever. And I hope that I've made it clear during this talk that this list is not a random set of unconnected elements, but there is a deep connection between them. I didn't talk about grandmothers yet, I can go into questions. There's a deep connection between them which links cooperation, based on our ecology, with intelligence. And on that, I thank you for your time.